Hello, Comics Alternative fans. Before we start with the episode, we want to invite all of you to check out our Patreon campaign.
That's right. Go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative for more details. There you'll find more information about the campaign and the cool rewards levels we have.
For as little as $1 a month, you can help us maintain good quality comics talk, and the more you contribute, the more perks you get.
These include monthly podcast episodes exclusive to Patreon supporters, as well as the chance to help us choose which books we review on the show. So be sure to visit www.patreon.com/comicsalternative and become one of our proud podcast patrons.
Yeah, and now on with the show.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 132, reviews of The Leaning Girl and Unflattening.
The following program is brought to you in living color on NBC.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode, we're going to be looking at a couple of books. First, we're going to be discussing a work that came out last year, The Leaning Girl, created by François Schuiten and Benoît Peeters. And then after that, we're going to look at a brand new book by Nick Sousanis, Unflattening. But before we get to those, we want to let all of our listeners know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, and they'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse comics at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that the discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price, and every single month you'll find incredible and unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials are at 45% off, sometimes they're at 50% off cover price, but many times their discounts are more impressive than that.
That's right. In this month, they have a load of bundles that you can take advantage of and get a deeper discount on multiple books by the same publisher than you would get if you bought those books individually. There are bundles that include all 22 covers of the Archie #1 issue from Archie, and there are also Dynamite bundles, Valiant, Vertigo, 2 bundles from Vertigo, and DC and Marvel bundles to go along with their super special events going on this month.
That's right, and they have incredible specials just as they do every single month. You have to go to their website and find out more about the specials. That's dcbservice.com. Go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs, and when you do, please be sure to drop them a line and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
Well, Andy, I know that it's a busy time of the year for both of us, and we've got a lot to discuss. So let's go ahead and, instead of just chit-chatting, jump right into the books for today.
Yeah.
Now, the first one we're going to be discussing is actually not a brand new book, which is usually what we do here on the Comics Alternative, is we try to review releases, graphic novels, collections, individual issues that have come out over the past few weeks, maybe a month or so. This one, though, came out last year from Alaxis Press, and it is The Leaning Girl. It's part of the Obscure City series. This one is created by François Schuiten, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that name correctly. and then also Benoît Peeters. These guys have created the multi-volume Obscure Cities series that has, I guess, been spottily translated into English in the past. The entire series has never been translated into English, but beginning last year, and even before that, I think that started as a Kickstarter campaign, Alexis Press, and Alexis Press gets its name from the Obscure Cities series, started to take on this gargantuan task of putting all the volumes into print, into English. So we have the first of the series, The Leaning Girl, which is actually not the very first one in the Obscure Cities series. I think this is number 6 in the series. There are 11, but for some reason, and I don't know the logistics behind this or the reasoning behind it, instead of starting with the very first one, which has been translated in English before as The Great Walls of Samaras, they wanted to go with the 6th volume, The Leaning Girl.
Yeah, it looks like from Alexis Press's website that they say that that they don't want to duplicate those books that have already been published in English by NBM, going all the way back to 1987 with The Great Wall of Samaras. So it was in the 80s and 90s, really, that NBM put those volumes out. I don't know how readily available those books are right now, but it looks like Alexis's main goal is to complete those that haven't ever been translated before.
Huh. Now, maybe I'm wrong here, but I thought that those NBM books are no longer in print.
Yeah, I mean I don't know.
Yeah, and so maybe what they're doing, and again, is just speculating here, is that they're going to go first publish those that may not have had English translation through NBM, and then after those, maybe go back and republish the ones that NBM had into new editions, because one of the big draws for something like this would to have, let's say, on your shelf, all 11 volumes in nice, consistent format. And to tell our listeners about the format, this is a rather large European album format. Mm-hmm. So it's not only a joy to look at, and I want to talk about the art in a moment, but you have a large page spread to where you can really take in the art. And, for some who aren't used to this size of text, it may be a little harder to hold in your hand. It reminds me of a couple of years ago when we read Ben Catcher's latest book, and we were commenting in our interview with him how awkward at times it was to hold it. I don't think this is as awkward, but it's definitely worth the heft.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a big book, but it's a very, very nicely produced book. They're definitely Alexis Press is definitely putting this out for longevity. It's got a nice thick paper and good size.
Right. Now, we were talking about this being the 6th volume in the original French. So my question to you, Andy, is, now I would guess that you may be like me. This is the first time you're coming to Obscure Cities. Is that a correct assumption?
Yeah. Oh,
okay.
Yeah.
Did you if you had not known that this was part of a series, kind of in the very middle of the series, would you have felt that you understood everything, that you were losing no context?
I didn't feel like it was coming in the middle of a series at all. In fact, I didn't even really know that until kind of just preparing for this show that this was not volume 1. I think, though, but to say that you enter this book on a kind of safe level ground is not necessarily the case anyway. I mean, you're immersed in a very strange world right away, and so I just kind of went with the flow of the strangeness. So I don't know if I had read any of the other books, if I would have a greater sense of clarity about what this world is like.
Yeah, that's a good point. Now, I knew this was part of a series, and I knew that this was around the middle of the Obscure City series. But from beginning to end, I really didn't feel that by not having read any of the other volumes and not knowing anything about Obscure Cities outside of, a little context that I've read here or there, I didn't feel like I lost anything. And you're right about this being a strange and unusual world. But I think that the way that Schuiten and Peeters write, and especially Schuiten illustrates, for the most part, because it's not all illustration, as we can comment in a moment. It's a very immersive world. It's not, excuse me, it's not surrealistic in the Dali sense, but it is rather strange and defamiliarizing once you get into it. But at the same time, I think it's easy to get your narrative sea legs and to get a sense of what's going on. And fairly early on, you discover in the back and forth between, I guess, primarily the comics section and then this other art style, which is primarily, I guess for the most part, photographic, fumetti, that it deals with two different worlds where you have, the Obscure City world, which is where Mary, the protagonist, is living and where, for all practical purposes, the majority of things take place. And then there's, I guess you could call it our world. And so I think from what I understand that Obscure Cities is on kind of a parallel Earth on the complete opposite side of the sun. It's one of these deals. And that's how the stories in The Leaning Girl are set up. You have most of the action taking place on this counter Earth with its own time and its own history, its own architecture. And then you have the fumetti-based narrative that centers around this artist figure, Augustin Deschambre, who is having problems with his art, and the vast majority of his story is in photographs.
Right. So you've got the transition between Deschambre, who seems to be in our world, and the transitions that go on to bring these two stories together, because for a long time it feels like you're reading two separate stories, or in some cases even three separate stories, because there's the story of Mary the Leaning Girl, there's the story of Wappendorf the scientist, and then the story of Deschambre the artist, and only as the series goes along do we see these three things come together.
Yeah, you're right to point out that at first, at least in the first half of the book, it does seem that there are three different narratives going on. And by the time we get to, I guess it's almost the very middle of the book, as I'm looking at it now, the story of Mary and the story of Wappendorf come together. And so those two strands become one, and then they eventually link up with Augustin's narrative. Now, did you find those narrative divisions, and especially the ones between our Earth, which is the one that Augustin inhabits, and the world of Mary and Wappendorf, which is the Obscure Cities world, this counter-Earth. I mean, did you find that disorienting to the point of getting in the way of your comprehension or understanding or enjoyment?
Oh no, not at all. But, that goes back to what we were talking about earlier. I felt the need going into this to kind of give into that world, that kind of rely on the hope that these things would come together. But even if they didn't, there was such an immersive quality to the worlds that Schuiten and Peeters create in this book that I didn't really care if it ended up making sense or not. Yeah,
that's a good point. I mean, going into this, I was a little confused at first, but it's one of those deals where you trust in the narrative, you trust the creators, and there seemed to be enough here that really captured my attention. And I think one of those things that really struck me immediately is Schuiten's art. It's a very realistic, very detailed kind of art, and in fact, toward the end of the book, when we get this meshing or melding between photography and the more, I guess, semi-photorealistic art of Schuiten, it's an easy transition.
Yeah, that's true. I can't remember if it's in Peeters' introduction to The Leaning Girl or Karen Green, friend of the show, Karen Green's introduction to the Obscure Cities stories, where they compare the art to a Gustave Doré painting or illustration, and I felt that's really an accurate comparison. There, that highly detailed yet completely imaginative world.
Yeah, and that gets back to something else that was discussed, and I think this is in Peeters' introduction, and that is the architecture that you find. It's almost as if the buildings themselves, the city, and its many objects, and, including the observatory, become almost like characters.
Yeah, and since we're on Peeters' introduction, I was, in reading that first before getting into the rest of the book, I wasn't quite sure about the idea that Mary, the Leaning Girl, Mary von Rathen, has actually existed in the real world and corresponded with them and corrected their story and so on. Peeters kind of creates a sense that there might be a really obsessed fan out there, or this might be a place where the fantasy and reality have intersected.
Yeah, where life imitates art in this case, and then art coming back to be influenced by the reality. Yeah, this is fascinating, and it tells us a little bit about the popularity of the Obscure Cities series outside of the United States, that this definitely has a following, to the point that there is someone out there who is assuming the identity, as Peeters tells us, of Mary von Rathen and corresponding with them, and is even writing her, or at least Mary von Rathen's own life, that then becomes inspiration for what Schuiten and Peeters have done.
Right.
So, yeah, that is fascinating. So this is maybe a different kind of cosplay.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of the story that Grant Morrison tells about being at San Diego Comic-Con like 4 a.m. as he's working out All-Star Superman and sees Superman come toward him, and he talks to Superman all about about the series he's planning, and gets a whole bunch of his ideas for it, and seems to be utterly convinced that he actually did talk to Superman and not some guy in cosplay at San Diego Comic-Con.
Wow. So Mary von Rathen's not near as well known as Superman, though.
Yeah, I guess not.
Maybe to European readers.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to me that when those kind of things, those kind of publishing situations occur, where Alexis Press, as you pointed out, takes its name from the Obscure Cities, so it seems to be a press that's solely created to put out these books, possibly.
Exactly.
And that this rather obscure publisher and very focused publisher is putting out what is an enormously popular work in Europe, and yet that disconnect between what American comic readers and American fans are aware of and what's popular in Europe is is really interesting. Why is it would be this is does this have the potential to be maybe not the same level of phenomenon in America as in Europe, but have have the rabid following that in America that it has in Europe.
That would be cool. And, of course, if someone was going to become a fan of this and, let's say, actually do the cosplay, how could they lean like Mary does?
Yeah.
That would be interesting.
Yeah, that would be hard. And it seems like Mary leans in the book, hence the title Leaning Girl. We haven't really talked much about the plot.
Yeah, I just realized that, yeah.
And she leans as the result of some kind of astronomical event in which there's a complete, what's thought to be an eclipse of Earth, which turns out to be a kind of another planet passing. Or not Earth, but whatever the planet is that the obscure city is on, another planet kind of passing in with it. And her leaning becomes a part of, or is a result of that occurrence, and she becomes ostracized because of this from her family and from society in general until she's able to join a circus and gain some level of respect and popularity that way. And then she hooks up with the scientist Wappendorf, who seems to have a theory about seems to be able to come up with a theory about why she leans and how that is related to the astronomical event, and then they go to seek out a solution. Right. I guess is the best way I can describe that. So but she does say that her leaning does have some strain on her ankles. So yeah, it isn't a normal posture.
Yeah, and they take a Jules Verne-like journey to this counter Earth, and when they get there, this is when they connect with that third narrative thread that we mentioned earlier, the one with Augustine, who is from, I guess, our Earth. And there's something on this counter world that is askew. There's the way they describe it. There's one globe in a particular place that is very much linked to Augustine's art, but this is shattered or it's broken in some way, and that's what's causing the skew in gravitation, I guess you could call it, and that's why she tilts or she leans, because she becomes resonant with this world in ways that others on the counter Earth or this counter world isn't. It's a relatively, it may not sound like it from the way you and I described it, but I think it's a relatively straightforward story. But after I finished it, I thought that it was much more elaborate than it actually was. And then I went back and started to look at the individual chapters and how they're divided. And I thought, there's really not that much to the story. It's just a simple storyline, but there is a lot of density. There's a lot of meat on this narrative.
That's right.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that comes out in the characterization and definitely the locales, the aforementioned architecture, the various places that they go. And like I said, the characters, one of my favorite of which is Mr. Raoul. Mm-hmm. A chimp on a bike.
Yes. Well, that's always good. That's gold right there. Yeah, I like that. I like that character. And I think Mary is an engaging character as well. And we do get a lot of Augustine as well through his narration of the photographic sections.
Yeah, exactly. And even the minor characters like Von Rathen, her father, who at first comes across almost as an insensitive father, like Mary's mother is definitely disengaged. But then we see that that's not the case at all, and he goes in search of her. And then the circus leader, what is his name, that brings her into his circus? I can't remember. But even he's, I think, fleshed out fairly well for a minor character. Yeah,
and he is one of the people who's sympathetic and to Mary's condition, and for whom the Mary's luck kind of turns around when she's with him.
Right. And, I think that in talking about her relationship with the circus owner, it gets back to what you were talking about a second ago, and that is the significance of her character is, she's a very strong individual. She is a teenager when the story begins. So, she likes to have fun. She likes to do her own thing. She's a little rebellious, but not too much so. But even when she finds acceptance, for instance, in the circus after being rejected by those that she, is at school with, and then, when she's wandering the streets, after a while, she becomes dissatisfied and she wants to strike out on her own. She wants to find answers and she wants to eventually get back home. So she's willing to take a chance and leave the person, this circus leader, that took her in and helped her.
Yeah.
And that says something about her character, who she is. And then we see that with a vengeance toward the end when Augustin comes in and meets her. And we don't want to give anything away here about how things are resolved. But I think her coming into her own reaches a crescendo in that last part.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
And it involves some nakedness.
That's right.
Not to be too salacious about it.
Right. And at this point, she probably still is underage.
Yeah, that's true too. I kind of went back and tried to figure that out, and it's like, oh, okay. Yep, that's true.
Yeah. But, this takes place not in puritanical America.
That's true.
So there you go. And again, as we mentioned, this came out early 2014, and I know one of the reasons why we wanted to discuss this book is that according to the Obscure Cities website, we're about due for the third release, which is The Shadow of a Man, which is listed as coming out in spring 2015. And then before that, released supposedly in December of 2014, was the second release, The Theory of the Grain of Sand. And I don't know, Andy, you and I were discussing right before we started to record. It says on the website that these will be released at these dates, but I did a search on Amazon and didn't see either of those titles. So I have no idea if things are just pushed back. As you mentioned, this is a press created solely for the English release, the translation, and then the release of the Obscure Cities volumes. So they could be having delays on of their own.
Yeah, because it also points out that on their website that they were going to release the 40-page children's book version of the Leaning Girl called Mary the Little Leaning Girl, which is a different
that's right.
version of the same narrative, and that was supposed to come out at Christmas and probably around the same time as The Theory of the Grain of Sand, but it doesn't appear that either of those have come. So I do hope that Alexis Press is going to continue to release these books because they're quite nice. Oh,
they're beautiful, and when reading them was a joy, and looking at them, they're gorgeous. This is a wonderful volume, and one of the things we'll do is we'll put links in the show notes to the Obscure Cities website because there are some pretty interesting videos that they have, and I'm guessing that these are some of the same videos you could find on their Kickstarter page as well.
Yes.
Okay, do you want to move on to the second book that we're going to be discussing for today?
Yeah.
And this is Unflattening by Nick Sousanis, or Sousanis. I'm not sure how you pronounce his last name. And this is the first, and it may be the only book that we're ever going to review on the Comics Alternative, published by Harvard University Press.
Yeah, that's true. And I hope it is not the first of not the last of, it is the first doctoral dissertation written in the form of a comic that we've read.
Exactly. So I guess we should give a little backstory to this book, which just came out.
Right.
So, yeah, this was a Sousanis' doctoral dissertation at Columbia.
Yeah, Columbia. I was trying to figure out where it was.
Yeah, and it's published from Harvard, but he got his doctorate in education at Columbia Teachers College. Mm-hmm. Was it last year that he got
fairly recently? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this book just came out this month, but he got his dissertation or his doctoral dissertation defended last year, I believe. And so this caught our attention. I remember talking about this. I can't remember when, but at some point you and I were discussing this. Our attention because this was a doctoral dissertation. And in addition, Harvard University Press was going to be publishing that. So, I mean, those are two things that are very unusual. And we wanted to make sure that we reviewed it for the Comics Alternative. Mm-hmm. So there's a little backstory on this, and how would you describe Unflattening?
That's a good question. When kind of taking even a step back before getting into that, what I had expected when I first read about Unflattening was that it might be a work on the level of, say, Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, where it was going to be a way of describing how comics work, and it does do some of that. There are sections of the book that are focused fairly specifically on comics and the way we read comics, and Sousanis in many very interesting ways plays around with the way that we read comics by using the art to guide us through caption boxes that are not necessarily, that we don't read necessarily in the left to right order that we would normally read caption boxes. He has a kind of occasionally flowing set of images that gives us a path to follow.
Exactly.
With those boxes, and I think that's interesting.
Yeah, and in fact, that section that you're referring to that deals heavily with comics is the third chapter of the book, The Shape of Our Thoughts.
Right.
Yeah.
But then, for the most part, Unflattening seems to be a meditation on seeing, on the way we see, the way we experience
the world
and reality and so on, using straight through the book, using Edwin Abbott's Flatland as his novella Flatland as a kind of a through line.
Right. Yeah, exactly. In fact, he begins. In fact, the second section of the book is called Flatland, is when he gives us a little background of Abbott's romance Flatland. So, and then he uses that as a reference text throughout. So it's very intertextual in that way. I guess I expected somewhat like you for this book to be an expository meditation on something. I didn't necessarily think it was going to be on comics, but I didn't know what it was going to be on. I guess maybe from some of the pub stuff, and given the title of what he means by unflattening. In other words, kind of expand and open up, as you put it, our way of seeing the world, perceiving, understanding reality, and being open to different experiences and different ways of seeing. That's what I was expecting. So I was a little surprised by the time we got to the third chapter, The Shape of Our Thoughts, that this was dealing heavily in comics. I say a little surprised, not because I thought it didn't fit. It definitely fit in. But in the first couple of sections, that wasn't necessarily, at least comics, wasn't the direction where Sousanis was going. And I think he did a really good job in this third chapter, of linking comics and what comics do and how we take in and experience the medium, and links it to other things that he had been previously saying. I think that worked really well. Go ahead.
No, yeah, I think that it's when you mentioned earlier that he got his degree from Columbia University's Teachers College, there's definitely a kind of pedagogical element to this book, that it is about teaching how to see from different perspectives, and using a kind of history of ideas, especially ideas in which someone has come up with a new way of seeing the world, whether it's figuring out that the Earth is round, or that the Earth is not the center of the universe, and so on. That we go through this, and that using the metaphor of flatland, that we ourselves need to not be like the flatlanders and be able to see beyond the limitations of our own experience and our own perception.
Yeah. And, what you just said reminded me of my experiences in the first few chapters of Flattening. It reminded me of a graduate course I took years ago at UNC Greensboro when I was in their liberal studies program. There was one class, and I can't remember the exact title of it, but it was something like Critical Responses to Science in Western Culture, or something to that effect. And it was taught by a historian. His area of specialty was the history of science. And so this course was devoted to alternative ways of looking at the world that were kind of in opposition to, or at least responses to, some of the great scientific and philosophical thinkers. So, for instance, we started with Pascal's Pensée, and looked at it in many ways as a response or as an alternative to the Cartesian worldview. And from there, we worked our way forward. So there are a variety of different thinkers that we read. We definitely did a lot of reading in the Romantics. I know Wordsworth was someone we focused on quite a bit. Friedrich Nietzsche. We also read Thomas Dewey, who is also mentioned in Unflattening, and worked our way up. I think the most contemporary we got was existentialism in the mid-20th century. And so when I first started reading Unflattening, I thought, oh my God, this would be the perfect text for a class like that, until I got to chapter 4. And because you mentioned that in the early chapters, Sousanis gives somewhat of a history of different ways of looking at the world. He mentions Copernicus, Galileo, Descartes. But then after chapter 4, things, I think, seem to plateau in terms of the direction, or at least the trajectory that he's taking. And I don't know if that's the most appropriate way of putting it, but I personally felt that after that third chapter that we've discussed, the one where he looks at comics and links it back into what he's been talking about earlier, different ways of looking at the world, that from chapter 4 on, which is the second half of the book for all practical purposes, before you get to the notes, I didn't get the sense that he was going in any new direction. I thought that he was saying in different ways some of the same things that he had been saying in the first part, in the first 3 chapters, that setup.
I didn't necessarily have that impression, though. If you were to ask me what does he add later, I couldn't necessarily say. What I did feel by the time I started to get to that point was that this is a book I might need to read more than once, and that and it's not a book to be read casually either. So I felt like at some points that I needed another go through to make sure I kind of understood how it all held together.
Yeah, you're right that this is a book that you need to take your time going through. You can't just whip through it and feel that you understand or could grasp what Sousanis is talking about here. And it does warrant, multiple readings. And because that was what I was wondering before, as I was preparing for our discussion, how would my feelings about this book be if I go back and reread it a second and third time, having the luxury and the time to do that. I don't know. But I did feel that starting in that chapter, Our Bodies in Motion, I mean, he was saying a lot of really good stuff, and I think the art is phenomenal. The way he not only tells but shows his points, his arguments, and his story are one of the big draws of Unflattening. But in a book that has, and I'm looking at the table of contents, which is visual and graphic, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 sections. Our Bodies in Motion is that fourth section, and so that's not quite the middle. But around that time, I felt that he was saying some of the same things that he had said earlier. Same thing with that next chapter, the fifth dimension, then ruts, strings attached vectors, and then awakening appropriately ends the text proper. But I don't know. I don't want to, be like a harsh critic of this work. But again, my feeling was that after that third chapter, where he does bring in comics, things just kind of level off in his argument, and he doesn't say much that's new or. I mean, he expands upon certain thoughts, and that's great. I just didn't feel that it had the momentum that the first part of the book did.
Well, I think I do think I'd have to reread it before being able to judge it on that.
Yeah. On
that particular point, because, like I said, I didn't get that sense, but I can't necessarily refute what you're saying either.
Yeah. And that leads me to another, I don't know if it's a question or a point of speculation, because, both you and I have been on thesis committees where we have looked at student projects, either master's theses or doctoral dissertations, and, whether we are the director of that thesis or dissertation or we're just, a committee member, we still have to be critical. And we have to, challenge the candidate. I'm wondering what kind of what it was like to sit in on this committee for Sousanis's dissertation committee, and if there was much or little criticism given the medium. What I mean by that is, I wonder what members of his committee, and I would probably guess none, otherwise they probably wouldn't have been on this committee, would have been resistant to this guy doing something that really no one does, and that is, creating a dissertation that is a comic, in essence. And by the way, I am glad that Sousanis chooses to call the medium comics. At one point earlier on, he says different people call it different things. He chooses comics. Great. Right. Kudos to him. On the other hand, though, I'm wondering if the committee, being, I don't know, maybe excited, maybe mesmerized by the fact that this was something very, very different, if they weren't as challenging as they could have been. I mean, I have no way of knowing. And I was thinking of that in light of the aforementioned last half of the book that, at least for me, seemed to kind of top out.
The first place I'd heard about this project was on the Chronicle of Higher Education's website back, I think, over a year ago, back in February of 2014, in an article they published on their chroniclevitae.com site, The Amazing Adventures of the Comic Book Dissertator. And in that article, the reporter actually does talk to Sousanis's dissertation director, and talks about the dissertation committee, and about how that. I mean, he wasn't finished with the dissertation at the point that this article was written, but they talk about going through it, and that actually some of the committee wasn't kind of comics proficient, going in. So it's an interesting article, and the article then also gets into other kind of experimental dissertations that are being done more recently, like blog dissertations and so on. Because when I first heard about this and then saw that it was getting published, I thought about that. What was that situation like? How does somebody approach their committee and say, I'm going to do my dissertation in comics form, and then what's the marketability of someone coming out of grad school with that as a dissertation? But looking at the book, I think that I feel like I can see the places where the dissertationness of this book became significant, and it's especially true in the notes. That it feels like the notes are really the part of the book where the research comes to the fore, and you see the theoretical underpinnings of the whole book.
Exactly. I'm glad you mentioned the notes, because we don't think we've touched upon those yet. But it's a good part of this book in the back. And of course, I don't think you would have Unflattening without the notes and the bibliography at the end. But let's say, for argument's sake, if we did have Flattening without the notes, without the the obvious research that went into this, I would say that this is more of a creative writing thesis than it was a dissertation. And in fact, even with the research and the notes at the end, there's a part of this that does still strike me as more of a creative writing project than at least the traditional dissertation. But that gets back to what Unflattening is all about, right? Trying to expand our understanding of what we take as the norm. So this whole idea of the traditional dissertation, should be put into question from the very beginning. Yeah,
and I think that I'm really interested in that idea in terms of the future of academia anyway, because we've for years been hearing about the death of the scholarly monograph, that the publisher perish model is not going to be sustainable in academia, and yet we haven't really seen too many alternatives emerge. And so I'm curious to see how. And then I also think graduate school is for many anyway an inherently kind of conservative time, even though at the same time you're kind of exploring these great ideas and all that stuff. There's a push to be conservative. There's a push to do the traditional dissertation, don't screw around with it, and if you're in literature, do literature, stuff like that. Which we all experienced. And so if Sousanis has success with this model, and currently he is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Calgary with Bart Beatty. So, if you're going to study comics anywhere, that's probably the place to do it, next to maybe Ohio State. But anyway, that if this turns into getting published by Harvard University Press is a feather in the cap as well. So if this leads to levels of success for Sousanis professionally, then maybe we'll see more unconventional dissertations or even more comic book dissertations.
Oh yeah, exactly. But I think getting back to my earlier comments about the creative writing aspect of this, if this had been any other kind of comic, if this had been one that was more overtly a narrative, fictional or otherwise, I mean, definitely that's something that could easily, relatively speaking, be done in a creative writing program, just as traditional prose fiction, short stories, novels, or whatnot are created. This is something different, though, entirely, in that it is taking, this the very thesis of expanding the way that we look at the world. And Sousanis is doing the research, and you can tell, and bringing in a variety of different thinkers, theorists from different disciplines, from philosophy, from philology, from, physics, mathematics, bringing all of this together, literature, and so I think that's what's so impressive about this. And yeah, I still get the feeling that it kind of plateaus after the first half, but even then, I mean, it's still something very different than what we had. And I think had he gone on to come back to a more historical point of view in the second half as he does in the first, then I think this would be, as I mentioned earlier, the perfect text to use in a variety of college courses, like, for instance, the one that I had mentioned, critical responses to Western, scientific thought, which is, I think, is what underlying what this book is all about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know about the kind of creative writing element of it. I do feel like it is overall an essay comic. Mm-hmm. So there's that, and it is well researched, and I felt well argued, and I personally thought about maybe not teaching the whole thing, but using at least parts of it, even in an English 101 or 102 class. I think some of it gets a little too theoretical and dense for that audience, and that's not it's not a problem with the book itself, but the more about the audience. So I would like, but I think the idea of teaching students this idea of trying to imagine and see from different perspectives is really a useful idea, and the different metaphors he uses for that, like parallax and so on, is a good way of entering a conversation with students on that subject.
Exactly. Yeah, you mentioned the essay aspect of this. I mean, it's no accident that Scott McCloud writes one of the blurbs on the back.
Right.
It's very much like Understanding Comics and other works that he's done. And I will bet you money right now, if you're willing to wager, that this book or a section of this book will be in a future Houghton Mifflin Harcourt Best American Comics.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. If for no other reason, because it's different. Mm-hmm. And that's a conversation we have every year, and this definitely does stand out. And I have no idea of knowing if this will be one of my favorites from 2015. Whether it is or not, it definitely is one that stands out as notable.
Yeah, just
because it's so different.
Yeah. I'm really curious to see what happens with not just with Sousanis' work from now on, but also with future works of scholarship in comic form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting to see.
Mm-hmm.
So there you have it. Wrapping up our discussion of Nick Sousanis' Unflattening from Harvard University Press. And before that, Andy and I discussed the first published volume from Alaxis Press, at least, in the Obscure Cities series, The Leaning Girl, from François Schuiten and Benoît Peeters. Great books, and definitely both are fascinating projects to discuss. And if you want to find fascinating comics like we do, well, do like we do and use the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Was that an okay segue?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. If you go to their website, dcbservice.com, you're going to find incredible specials, not just for this month, not just for April, but every month throughout the year. You can't go wrong with the people at Discount Comic Book Service and then their sister company, In Stock Trades. Check them out, too. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think. You can contact us by going to our website, and in a browser, you'll find a tab that says Send Voicemail. Click on that, and using the SpeakPipe program, you can leave us a message from the comfort of your own computer or mobile device. It's just that simple. Or you can call us on the phone. The phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right, or you can get a hold of us by email. We are 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
We also have our Twitter feed where you can find new updates to our podcast as well as new content to their blog. Check out our Twitter feed at the number 2 Guys with PhDs.
That's right. We're also on Facebook, on Tumblr, and on Instagram. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And as always, you can find every single one of our episodes as well as our reviews and comics-related commentary on the blog at comicsalternative.com.
That's right, all the ways to get a hold of us and find out how we're doing.
And we appreciate you getting in touch, either through those means that we just mentioned or participating on the forum. That's always fun to hear from you guys.
Yep.
So get in touch with us, and until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.